Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to move and support Amendment A in my name and the name of the Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State ended by saying we've got to hold our nerve. He was all over the place this morning, all over the place on all of the important issues. Mr. Speaker, it's obvious what the Prime Minister is up to. She's pretending to make progress while running down the clock. A non-update every other week to buy another 2 weeks of process, inching ever closer to the 29th of March deadline in 43 days. We should not be fooled. Look at the history in recent months and set it against the exchanges this morning. The Prime Minister pulled the meaningful vote on the 10th of December, promising to seek further reassurances on the backstop. She feared significant defeat, and it was obvious that the backstop was the problem way back then, as it had been through the autumn. That was 66 days ago. It was then 109 days till the 29th of March. And I will in a minute. And she returned with nothing. With nothing. Warm words in the margins of the EU summit in December, and a letter coupled with a statement about Northern Ireland that simply repeated already existing commitments. That's what she came back with. The meaningful vote was then put on the 15th of January and lost heavily. That evening, the Prime Minister stood at that dispatch box and promised to explore ideas with the European Union following cross-party talks on how to proceed. That was 30 days ago. And then 75 days until the 29th of March. I will in just a minute. Then, and 2 weeks after that, on the 29th of March, the Prime Minister voted for the so-called Brady Amendment, calling for, I will give way in just a minute, calling for the backstop to be replaced with alternative arrangements. Extraordinary. A Prime Minister voting to support her own deal only on condition that it's changed. Conditional support for her own deal. Now, nobody prepared the business community for that. Nobody prepared Northern Ireland for that, or EU leaders. And anybody who's spoken to businesses or been to Northern Ireland or spoken to political leaders in the EU in recent days knows that by three-line whipping her own MPs to vote against the deal she negotiated, the Prime Minister has lost a good deal of trust in the process. I will give way.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Can he not understand the nonsense of his own argument, suggesting on the one hand the Prime Minister is trying to run down the clock and then listing the various occasions where she has attempted to stop the clock, get a deal and exit the European Union?
I'm grateful for that intervention. I think the honourable members missed the point. Yes. The Prime Minister has spent weeks. The honourable member wants an answer and wants to interrupt whilst I'm trying to speak. The Prime Minister has spent weeks and weeks and weeks trying to negotiate changes to the backstop. It started way before the vote was pulled on the 10th of December, and it's gone on ever since, and she's got absolutely nowhere. I will give way. I'll just make the next point and then I will give way. The idea that the vote on the 29th of January for the Brady Amendment gave clarity is for the birds. The government united around a proposition that they want an alternative to the backstop. But uniting around an alternative that means different things to different people doesn't get anybody anywhere. And that's the central problem. I will just in 1 minute. Yesterday, after another non-update from the Prime Minister, what she said about the backstop was this. Tuesday, I'm corrected. She said on the backstop she wanted, and she listed 3 things. 1, a time-limited backstop, or an ability unilaterally to end the backstop, or alternative, arrangements. That's how she put it. Well, the first two of those have been repeatedly ruled out by the EU for months, and there's no sign of any movement. And the Secretary of State, in his discussions in Brussels in recent days, knows that very, very well. There's no room for move on those two fronts. The third, I will in just a second, the third alternative arrangements remains undefined. When the Prime Minister is pressed, either here or in Brussels, about exactly what she means, she doesn't say. And the Malthouse Compromise and the answer the Secretary of State give the game away. If that was a serious proposition that the government was engaging in, it would adopt it as policy and put resource into it. But it isn't. And what signal does that send to Brussels about what the government really thinks about the Malthouse Compromise? I will give way.
I'm very grateful for the right honourable gentleman giving way, and can I commend him for his courage and bravery in standing up for his own alternative arrangements, which of course include a second referendum. And I just wonder, how is he getting on with that within his own party? But more importantly, does he believe a second referendum would increase or decrease investor and business confidence in the United Kingdom?
Well, I'm happy for the concern. I'm getting on fine. Thanks very much. And I'll tell you, I'll tell you the one thing. On business certainty, I'll tell the House this, because I've been talking to hundreds of businesses across the country. Even in the last 10 days, I've been in Belfast, in Cardiff, in Birmingham, and in Dublin talking to businesses. And what they're most concerned about is the uncertainty of the situation that we're in now. And all of them would welcome anything that prevents a no-deal Brexit. I will give way.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. Isn't it the case that all these meetings and activity that he is outlining are not, when it comes down to these alternative arrangements, are really just the repetition of the Brexit unicorns on no hard border that we've heard time and time again, and that the reality is the government's strategy on this is the same as it's always been, which is the desperate hope that Chancellor Merkel will come to the rescue and that the European Union will throw Ireland under the bus.
Absolutely.
I completely agree with that intervention and that observation. I give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving away. He's been talking to businesses as I have, and would he agree with me that the issue of no deal is not simply a matter for March the 28th, it's a matter for now, because exports can take 6 weeks. Companies are making the decisions now as to how they will need to be planning to trade.
Well, I do agree with that. And one of the things that saddens me most in the discussions I've had in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and the Secretary of State and others who've had those discussions know exactly what is being said, it is that decisions are having to be made because of the fear of no deal, that decisions are being triggered, and the chilling bit in the discussions I've had, that some of the steps now are irreversible. And it's the first time we've got to that point. I promised I'd give way anyway.
I'm very grateful, gentleman, for giving on. Isn't the thing that this House has got to understand that the backstop is there in case the Malthouse Compromise turns into the Malthouse fantasy, if all the technologies are technological fantasies, that Europe cannot give up on the backstop because of all the wishy-washy promises from the UK government. They have to stick with it, and they just don't understand that.
Well, the EU has been very clear about the backstop, and there are honourable members working on the Malthouse Compromise, and that is to be observed. But it is equally to be observed the government has not adopted that as its policy position. And I'll just make a bit of progress just on this point, because so it goes on, and so it will go on. The simple and painful truth is this: if there had been a viable alternative to the backstop, there would never have been a backstop. The negotiating parties, as everybody knows, searched for months for that elusive alternative. If there had been an alternative, this Prime Minister would never have signed up to the backstop, and neither would the EU. They searched, and they did not find it. And everybody who has observed the negotiations knows that. The chances of a breakthrough now in 43 days seem to me to be slim. I will give way.
And I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving way. He makes a powerful point, as always, about the ineptitude of this government. Now, we know that there's not a whole lot of love, even on St Valentine's Day, for the government's deal. We know that. And we know that we're in danger of crashing off the cliff edge with the damage that will cause, and he's right to highlight that. Will he back our amendment that very simply asks for an extension of no less than 3 months to ensure we can avoid that no-deal Brexit?
Yeah. I'm grateful for that, and I do. I have sympathy with the point that we're going to need an extension of Article 50 sooner or later, and frankly, whether a deal goes through or not. The question is, what's the precise mechanism and binding mechanism for doing that? And we will be supporting the bill that's been proposed by others in due course, and I'll come back to that point. I'll give way there.
I thank the right honourable member for giving way. He is being generous. But can I just say, in contrast to what he actually has just claimed now, the Secretary of State has been admirably clear in his point that if, although a good deal is preferable to a no deal, if there is no deal, we will be leaving on the 29th of March on those terms. Can I suggest to my right honourable member that actually the Labour Party has this unfortunate habit of taking everything that the EU says at gospel, and that's clearly not the case, and they ignore the fact that the EU could write the textbook on 11th hour deals. Have some optimism and the ability to achieve them.
As for the Prime Minister taking us out of the EU on the 29th of March this year without a deal, we'll see about that. We'll see about that. I don't think the majority in this House are going to countenance that. I think the majority in this House will do everything they can to prevent that. And I will say this, having worked with the Prime Minister when she was Home Secretary and I was Director of Public Prosecutions, I know she's got a deep sense of duty, and deep down, I do not think that this Prime Minister will take us out without a deal on the 29th of March, and that's the basis on which we should be having this discussion. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to the Shadow Brexit Secretary for giving way, and he's absolutely right about what he says of business and the need for clarity. And it is clear for all to see that this government will need to apply for an extension to avoid no deal, even if it has a deal. But the reason they are not doing so, and that Brexit Secretary is not saying what he should to give certainty to business, is because that party will not face down the party within a party that is the ERG. Face these people down.
Well, I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for that intervention, and the honourable member puts his finger on it. Mr. Speaker, I am going to make some. I will give way.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way on that point. And is he not as astonished as I am that we have a Prime Minister and a government that are willing to play this kind of reckless gamble with the future prosperity of our country just to keep their rotten party together?
Well, it is a gamble. It is a gamble. I'm going to make some progress. I've taken a lot of interventions, and I'll take some more in a minute. I will give way later, yeah. The simple point I was making is this, and I stand by it. Both sides of the negotiation have been searching for this alternative for most of the negotiations, and certainly since the Phase 1 agreement was signed off December a year ago. They've been searching for the alternative, and they haven't found it. If they had, we wouldn't have a backstop. And the likelihood of them finding it in the next few weeks seems very slim to me. And even if they do, the chances then of the deal getting through and everything that has to follow by the 29th of March is even slimmer. There is so much legislation that needs to go through, so many statutory instruments. And that exposes, Mr. Speaker, and this has come out through the comments across the House, that exposes what is really going on. A Prime Minister who is running down the clock, hoping to get to March or even the end of March, and this House should remember the next EU summit is the 21st of March, so if we're getting real changes to the deal, that's where it's likely to be signed off. And then at that late stage, the plan is to put essentially the same deal back to this House as a binary choice, my deal or no deal, perhaps with some additional words which the attorney can say have real significance, but it will be essentially the same deal. That, Mr. Speaker, that is not holding your nerve. That is plain reckless. And we have to say no. I will give way.
I'm most grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman giving way. He is indeed being extraordinarily generous today. No self-respecting businesswoman or businessman would walk into a deal for negotiations and take no deal off the table. What we have here is the United Kingdom negotiating a business deal, the biggest business deal in the history of the United Kingdom. It therefore makes sense that we keep no deal on the table, because we know the history of the EU, that they do make concessions at the last moment. We need to hold our nerve, because if we do, then at the wire we will get a good deal which will be in the interests of both the EU and the United Kingdom.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know how to let the honourable member down gently, but let me try this. We are so patently unprepared for no deal that it is not credible. It is not credible that we can. Let me just give this example. There are very serious allegations against people in custody under European arrest warrants across the EU, going between our country and the EU 27 and vice versa. If we leave without a deal, we haven't got any arrangements in place to deal with that. The idea that we're going to do it in that way is simply unfounded. And I'll also say this, Mr. Speaker, because I've heard this argument before that if we actually face the truth and say no deal isn't credible, somehow that plays into the EU's hands. We heard this for the last 2 years. When I stood here and said we need a plan, the government must publish a plan. Because remember the days they said they couldn't even publish a plan, they objected, because it would give the game away, the negotiations would be over. And then they published a plan. Then I stood here and I argued that we should have the impact assessments. And what was the response? If we have the impact assessments, the show will be over. Nobody in negotiation would do that. And then I stood here and said we need the legal advice, and we got the same argument. Well, if you do that, the show will be over. You'll give everything to the EU. And now the same thing on no deal. It's not credible and it's not going to work. Mr. Speaker, no, I did say I'd give way over there. I'm sorry.
Thank you. An invisibility cloak on. Just over a week ago, there was a petitions debate about extending Article 50. Over 100,000 members of the public sent that in, and I spoke in that debate. It was sparsely attended. But can I say I did not hear from their front bench, the shadow front bench, that it was the policy of them to actually extend Article 50. In fact, it sounded from some of the speakers as if it was actually to have a people's vote. Can you confirm what they are arguing for?
I'm sure the question of policy is important, but I'm just facing the facing the practical reality. We're 43 days away from the 29th of March, and there isn't a credible alternative in sight. Now, either we accept that or we don't. And what's going on is the Prime Minister keeps coming back, giving a non-update. I'm meeting people. She's not saying I've actually agreed anything. Yeah. Can I have another 2 weeks? Yeah. And we've been going on like that for weeks, and it's got to stop. That's why, now I'm going to make some progress. That's why Labour's amendment today is intended to put a hard stop to running down the clock. It says that on the 27th of February, the government must put a deal to the House for its approval or bring an amendable motion so the House can take control of what happens next. And it's essential that we do so. Businesses are saying to us, well, they can't wait any longer. They're putting off investment decisions. They can't tolerate the threat of no deal. They're making contingency plans. We're implementing them, and some of them are irreversible. Yes, I will.
I am very grateful to him for giving way. Thank you. He's making a very strong point about the perils of no deal. But would he agree with me that this government's position on no deal is not just criminally reckless, it is plain stupid as well? Because the EU knows as well as we know that no deal would hurt us an awful lot more than it would hurt them. So threatening to put a gun to our own heads is not a clever negotiating strategy.
I agree, and I'm grateful, and that's really the point. That if it's not credible that we can leave on the 29th of March without a deal, and it's not, it actually isn't a negotiating stance at all. And it's never been seen in that way, and it doesn't work. And this is just farcical to suggest that we've got to keep up this pretence that we're ready, because then the EU will back down. It is ridiculous. And Mr. Speaker, let's just put some detail on this. We've heard the warnings from Airbus and Nissan about future jobs and investment in the UK. And yesterday from Ford, another huge UK employer, who said that no deal, and their words, would be catastrophic for the UK auto industry and Ford's manufacturing operations in this country. And that the country would, take whatever action is necessary to preserve the competitiveness of our European businesses.
The Right Honourable Gentleman is right to say that business wants certainty, and he's made big play of that. But it was the Confederation of British Industry, it was the FSB, it was GE Aviation in my constituency that said, for goodness sake, back the Prime Minister's deal. And he didn't do it, and he must understand that in failing to do so, he and the Labour Party become complicit in a crash-out.
Well, I'm not going to take that lying down. For this reason. On those benches, did they vote for the deal on the 29th of January? No, hang on, hear me out. The answer to that is no. And then anybody who voted for the Brady Amendment was saying it's conditional on change. So don't lecture anybody else about voting for the deal. Even the Prime Minister says, on reflection, I'm not voting for my deal unless there are changes. Well, you really can't throw the challenge across the House that we've got to support the unchanged deal, but the Prime Minister wants it changed. Some on the benches opposite will casually dismiss the threat of job losses as Project Fear. It's not Project Fear, it's Project Reality, and it's the jobs and livelihoods of those that we represent that are on stake. I'm going to make some progress, and then I will give way again. So we need to take whatever steps are necessary to prevent a no-deal exit. 2 weeks ago, this House voted to approve the motion tabled by my right honourable friend from Birmingham, Erdington, and the right honourable member for Meriden. That was hugely welcome, and it is just as binding on the government as what else was passed that evening. And you can't choose one part and not the other. And what it did, it showed what we've always said on this side. There is no majority in this House for a no deal. But make no mistake, I will give way.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. I've listened carefully today, and in defence of the Secretary of State, he's made it quite clear that the government's policy, if it comes to it and the deal doesn't pass on the week beginning the March 25th, the government policy is to leave with no deal. Yep. Is he clear in his mind what his party's position will be in the same circumstance?
I am, and happily we discussed that at our party conference and agreed unanimously, something I don't think that happened at the honourable member's party conference. The honourable member knows very well what it is. It is to vote on the deal. If the deal doesn't go through, to call for a general election. If that doesn't happen, two options: a close economic relationship and a public vote. And that was the position that we took. And we committed, to complete on this, we committed at our party conference to ensure that we take whatever steps are necessary to avoid a no-deal exit. And we will do so. I will give way.
Excuse me, I have a bit of a head cold. It's because of the amount of white flags being flown. It would give anyone a head cold. But can the Shadow Secretary confirm? Can the Shadow Secretary confirm that the Labour Party's position is that there must be legally binding changes to the withdrawal agreement on the backstop. It's the same position as the members in this bench.
The position of the Labour Party is that we have concerns about the backstop. This is a very serious point, and I intend to answer it. I haven't yet met anybody who doesn't have concerns about the backstop, both here and in Brussels. But we also recognise that at this stage, with the Article 50 window all but closed, we need a backstop. And it is inevitable that we need a backstop, and that is our position. I will give it.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to the Shadow Brexit Secretary for allowing me to intervene on that very, very important point. The right honourable gentleman is very knowledgeable about Northern Ireland and is a great friend to Northern Ireland. He will recognise the importance of the backstop to the people of Northern Ireland and across the United Kingdom indeed. So there seems to be some confusion about what his party leader, the leader of the Labour Party, says about the backstop and what he, as the Shadow Brexit Secretary, says. I think the people of Northern Ireland, indeed this House, are entitled to clarification from the right honourable gentleman about what exactly the position of the Labour Party is on the backstop.
He doesn't like it. I'm grateful for that intervention, and as the honourable member knows, I worked in Northern Ireland for 5 years with the policing board and know how deeply this is felt in Northern Ireland across all communities. And I was there for 2 days last week, and I made the point there that although we have concerns about the backstop, we do accept there must be a backstop and it is inevitable, and that therefore, notwithstanding those concerns, we support a backstop. And that's very important. Now, I'm going to make some progress. I've been waiting.
Honourable Member for giving way, because I actually find I agree with a great deal of what he's saying. He's saying that leaving with no deal would bring huge consequences for our economy and we shouldn't countenance it. But he's also saying that within the withdrawal agreement he sees the need for a backstop, and I've listened closely to what he said before, that he also agrees on the elements about needing a transition period and needing the certainty on citizens' rights. So given that he now appears to agree with everything that's in the withdrawal agreement, why won't he vote for it, and what more does he need?
I'm not sure the honourable member carefully read the proposition we were voting for in the meaningful vote. It was the withdrawal agreement and a political declaration taken together, and the statute requires them to be taken together, because you can't read the withdrawal agreement without reference to the political declaration, and vice versa. What I've said about the backstop is important, and it's important I say it for the whole of the United Kingdom, but particularly for people in Northern Ireland, and I stand by it. But, Mr. Speaker, no, I will give way.
I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for giving way. Is he able to clarify in plain English at what point the Leader of the Opposition will unequivocally back a people's vote?
The policy we've adopted is clear about what the options are, and what we're trying to do today is to put a hard stop to the running down of the clock. That will enable options to be considered in due course. I hope that will happen, and when they are considered, we will take our position and we'll see where the majority is in the House. Now, I'm going to make some.
Will he give way?
I will give way. Sorry, Chris, I will.
I'm grateful for giving way. The backstop is obviously taking up a lot of the discussion here today because it is incredibly important. Can I remind my honourable friend that in the debates leading up to the meaningful vote, concerns about trade were mentioned 3 times more than the backstop. Can I encourage him to move on now from the backstop and talk about all the other problems that people across this House have with this deal?
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention, because one of the central problems in all of this is that the political declaration is 26 pages long. It is vague in the extreme and simply talks about a spectrum of outcomes. The main theme of the political declaration is this: the extent of any checks at borders will depend on the degree of alignment. Therefore, there's a spectrum of outcomes. Well, I think we all understood that within hours of the referendum. And the idea that that is the position, and that is why, I will give way in just a second, that is why there's all this pressure on the backstop, because the political declaration is so ill-defined. I will give way.
Following his replies to the honourable members for Bracknell and Totnes, does he agree with me that the government has clearly rejected Labour's offer of a less damaging Brexit, and to wait until the end of March to activate our unanimously agreed conference policy in favour of a public vote would be far, far too late?
Well, I'm grateful for that point. What I will say is this. Just as I'm about to actually give the answers from Senator Bryn, what's the answer? Perhaps just listen. The position is this. As the House knows, we set out the position of the Labour Party in a letter to the Prime Minister in clear terms, setting out what a close economic relationship would look like. What was written in that letter has been well received, not only in the United Kingdom, by businesses and by trade unions, but by the EU and EU leaders. It is a credible proposition. We are now. I just want to complete on this because it's an important point. The Prime Minister has replied. The Prime Minister has replied in non-committal terms. You could say, well, that's inevitable, and we are having discussions, as the Secretary of State says. Now, I'm not going to disclose at this stage what those discussions are about, because they are, by their nature, confidential. They are ongoing. And I think the Secretary of State would want them kept confidential. That's the only way in which they can properly be held. And there are plans for further meetings. But to go back to the point that was raised, there must come a point where the options are clarified and reduced and then voted upon. And I agree with that proposition. And it needs to be done before the end of March. I will give it.
I'm very grateful. My honourable friend is making some important and good points about the Prime Minister running down the clock. But on this issue, he took that round of applause, that standing ovation at the Labour Party conference, which would have a people's vote with a Remain option. So I've been waiting very patiently for that section of his remarks, perhaps to disassociate himself with those from the General Secretary of Unite yesterday, who said it wouldn't be in the country's interests to have Remain on a ballot paper in a public vote. Now, we're aware that sections in letters and sections in remarks can sometimes have a habit of being redacted by others, perhaps further up the pay chain. Will he now assure us that within the next available opportunity we will be voting in favour of a people's vote?
No. I don't think I need to associate or disassociate with anybody on what my views are. I think they're pretty clear, and we will. And as for the timetable, I've set out the order of events, and I'm going to make some progress. I'm going to make some progress, and then I'll take more intervention. I've taken a lot of intervention. I am conscious. A lot of people who want to speak in this. I want to go back to the motion that was passed about no deal. Because that was passed by a majority in this House, and it is just as important, as I've said, as the other amendment that was passed. But make no mistake, on its own, it's not enough. If Parliament wants to prevent no deal, it has to take further action. We cannot be bystanders. We have to act. And the simple truth is this: we can't declare that we're against a no deal outcome, then do nothing. The government is failing to act. So we must act. Hence, the next step is to ensure that there's a hard stop to running down the clock, to ensure, not at the moment, to ensure that on the 27th of February the Prime Minister must either put her deal or allow Parliament to decide what happens next. But let's be clear, other steps, I'm just going to make this point, let's be clear, other steps need to be taken beyond today's amendment. They will include the bill tabled by my right honourable friend for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, which would provide a further safeguard against no deal and allow the House to decide if the government should seek an extension of Article 50 if no deal has been agreed by the 13th of March. I would hope that anyone who genuinely opposes no deal would see that an extension by that date, the 13th of March, is unavoidable. I will give way.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for giving way? I wonder if he could clarify for me then. I am sympathetic and almost supportive of the efforts from my friend from Pontefract and her bill, which I think is done with good sincerity. Could I ask on the front bench of the Labour Party, though, if we were to have an extension that went further than the 3 months, would it be his intention that we would participate in European Union parliamentary elections? Because I think for those going on the knocker this weekend, we ought to know.
As I've said from this dispatch box, so far as the extension is concerned, obviously it depends on the period, and the period that the EU have indicated might be available is a period to the 1st of July, because that avoids involvement in the parliamentary elections. It isn't our policy to participate in the parliamentary elections, and therefore, so far, for obvious reasons, we won't be... This is a really serious point, because there's this casualness about no deal that somehow we can, in a macho way, march off the cliff, it'll all be fine, it'll be so good for the country. The point is this, that if by the 13th of March, just over 2 weeks before the potential for no deal, there is no deal, we have to take action if we're serious about avoiding the calamity and catastrophe of no deal. And I don't mind standing up here and saying I will take whatever steps are necessary to avoid no deal, because I will never be persuaded that it's a good negotiating tactic or could possibly be good for our country. The House will then need to debate and vote on credible options to prevent no deal. We've been clear those options are either the close economic relationship that includes a customs union and close alignment to the single market that's set out in the letter to the Prime Minister, or a public vote on a deal or proposition that can command the support of the House. There are no other credible options remaining, and those options are miles away from the approach the government is currently taking. But first, we need to stop the government further running down the clock, put in a hard stop, allow this House to take control of the process. That's what today is about, and I urge all members to support our amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Kenneth